She was being beaten in broad daylight. Right there on the main street of Ashridge, in front of the general store, while a dozen people watched from behind glass windows and open doorways, and did absolutely nothing. Elena Mercer, 22 years old, had learned long ago that screaming didn't help. Begging made it worse. So she took it. Again. Like she always had. That morning was supposed to be like every other morning. Then a stranger walked in from the cold. If you want to know what one man's silence can destroy, and what it can build, stay with me until the very end. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The first thing most people noticed about Ashridge was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind of quiet you find on a Sunday morning when the whole world is still and soft and easy. Ashridge was quiet the way a room gets quiet right after someone says something cruel, a held breath silence, a turned eye silence, the kind that settles in when everyone has agreed without ever saying it out loud, to pretend they didn't see what they just saw. It was a frontier town pressed against the edge of the Montana mountains, like something that had been shoved there and forgotten. The buildings were practical and ugly, raw timber, iron fixtures, mud-caked storefronts with hand-painted signs that had long since faded. A general store, a livery stable, a post office that doubled as a saloon on Friday nights. Maybe 400 people living within a 2-mile radius, most of them stubborn as stone, most of them too tired from their own survival to care much about anyone else's. Winter came early to Ashridge. It came hard, and it stayed long. And every year, when the first real frost hit, the town folded inward on itself like something curling away from a flame. Elena Mercer had lived inside that silence her entire life. She was not remarkable to look at, or at least that's what 22 years of being told so had convinced her. Medium height, lean in the way that comes from never quite having enough to eat. With dark hair she kept braided and pinned so it wouldn't get in the way of her work. Her eyes were a pale gray-green, the color of river ice, though she'd long since trained herself to keep them aimed at the ground. Looking up too fast had earned her trouble too many times. She worked 6 days a week in Margaret Holt's general store, stocked shelves, swept floors, carried inventory from the back storeroom out to the floor in loads too heavy for one person, though no one ever offered to help. She handled the accounts on Saturdays, because Margaret's arthritis made writing painful, and Elena had a quiet talent for numbers that Margaret used without acknowledging. In exchange, Elena received a small room at the back of the building, barely bigger than a closet, with a single window that faced the alley, and 2 meals a day. No wages. Margaret called it an arrangement. Elena had never known a word for it other than life. Margaret Holt was 63 years old and had the particular cruelty of a woman who believed she was a good person. She gave to the church collection every month. She spoke warmly to customers. She told anyone who would listen that she had taken Elena in out of the goodness of her heart when the girl's mother died. And wasn't it a shame that Elena turned out so difficult, so ungrateful, so prone to mistakes? The mistakes, of course, were the problem. A broken jar. A wrong count in the ledger. A floor not swept to the exact standard Margaret decided on any given morning. These were the things that earned Elena what Margaret called correction, which was a word that meant an open hand, or a closed one, or a wooden ladle across the back of the legs, or any combination of the three, administered wherever and whenever Margaret judged it necessary, including, on a Tuesday morning in late November, in the middle of the general store's main floor, while 4 customers watched from less than 15 feet away. But so, it started over sugar. Elena had been restocking the dry goods shelf when Margaret came in from the back, face already tight with something that had gone wrong before Elena was even part of it. "I told you yesterday," Margaret said, her voice low and controlled, which was somehow worse than when she raised it, that the sugar needed to go on the left side of the shelf, not the right, the left. "I put it on the left," Elena said carefully. She kept her voice flat, her body still. She had learned early that flinching invited more. "Are you calling me a liar?" "No, ma'am. I'm saying I put it where you said." "Then explain to me," Margaret said, crossing the floor, "why I'm looking at it on the right side right now." Elena didn't answer. There was no correct answer. She knew that. Somewhere in the last few hours, someone had moved the sugar, a customer probably, picking it up and setting it back without thinking. And now the explanation didn't matter and the truth didn't matter because what mattered was that Margaret needed a reason, and Elena was always the reason. The first slap caught her across the left cheek. The second knocked her sideways into the shelf, and a tin of biscuits clattered to the floor. Elena grabbed the shelf edge to keep from going down. Her vision went white at the edges for a half second, then sharpened back into the ugly, familiar reality of Margaret's red face and the 4 customers at various points around the store who were all, to a person, studying something on a shelf, or looking at their boots, or staring out the front window with the focused attention of people pretending very hard to be somewhere else. One of them was a woman named June Parrish, who had once told Elena she had a kind face. June was now very interested in a display of canned peaches. "You do it again," Margaret said, breathing hard, "and it'll be worse. You understand me? I have half a mind to put you out in the cold right now." Elena said, "Yes, ma'am." Her cheek was burning. She could taste copper at the edge of her tongue. She bent down and picked up the biscuit tin. That was when the door opened. Cold air came in first, a solid wall of it, the kind that carried pine and ice and the smell of something vast and untamed. Then the man came through, and he had to turn slightly sideways to fit his shoulders through the frame. He was not what Elena would have called handsome, exactly. He was too rough for that word. Big, genuinely, quietly big, with a trapper's build that came from hauling dead weight through wilderness rather than from any particular vanity about it. His coat was dark canvas lined with something heavy, and it was dusted with snow along the shoulders. He had a jaw covered in several days of dark beard and eyes that were a very specific shade of brown, the color of river stones, steady and difficult to read. He carried a pack over one shoulder and a tied bundle of fox pelts over the other, which meant he was there to trade. He stopped 2 steps inside the door and took in the room. It was a fast thing, the way he read it. Just a sweep of those brown eyes across Margaret, across Elena still crouching on the floor with the biscuit tin, across the 4 customers who were working very hard at being invisible. Not a long look, just enough. Then he set his pack and his pelts down beside the door, very deliberately, and walked toward the counter. "Here to trade," he said. His voice was low, came from somewhere deep in his chest. Not aggressive, just real, the way a thing is real when it isn't trying to be anything else. Margaret smoothed her apron and reassembled her smile with the speed of long practice. "Of course. I'll take a look at what you've got." Elena rose from the floor, tucked the biscuit tin back onto the shelf, and went back to her restocking. She kept her face turned slightly away so her cheek wasn't the first thing anyone saw. She didn't look at the stranger. She had learned a long time ago that strangers didn't change anything. He spent about 8 minutes at the counter while Margaret examined his pelts and wrote down the trade value. Elena heard the scratch of Margaret's pen, the occasional murmur of numbers, normal sounds. She worked her way down the shelf, straightening tins, aligning labels, moving her body through a routine it knew by memory. She was reaching up to adjust a jar of preserves on the top shelf when Margaret said, behind her, "Elena, come settle this count. My eyes are bothering me." Elena turned and crossed to the counter. The stranger was standing on the other side of it. She placed herself next to Margaret, pulled the ledger over, and began reading the numbers. He was watching her. Not the way men sometimes watched her, which was a thing she knew how to disappear from. This was different. He wasn't looking at her the way you look at something you want. He was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't make sense, like a word that's spelled wrong or a door that opens the wrong direction. After a moment, without moving his eyes from her face, he said to Margaret, "What happened to her cheek?" The store went very quiet. Elena felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "She's clumsy," Margaret said. The smile stayed. "Always has been. It's a trial, honestly, but what can you do?" "That's not a fall." "I beg your pardon?" He said it again, same low voice, same unhurried pace. "That mark. That's not from a fall. I know what a fall looks like." The silence got heavier. One of the 4 customers, a man named Gerald Cross, who owned the tanning operation on the south side of town, cleared his throat and moved toward the door. "You don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said. Her voice had cooled by about 10 degrees. "This is a private matter. I'll thank you not to insert yourself into—" "Did she come with you to this store?" the man said. He was looking at Elena now, directly. "Or does she live here?" Elena's hand had gone still on the ledger. She didn't answer. "I'm asking you," he said. quieter, not unkind. Not her. She lives here, Margaret said. She works here. She has since she was a child. I raised her. I don't know who you think you are walking into my establishment and questioning how I— What's your name? He said, and it took Elena a moment to realize he was talking to her. She looked up slowly, those brown eyes, steady and even. No pity in them. Pity she knew how to deflect. This was something different. Attention, just pure attention, as though her answer was the only thing in the room that mattered. Elena, she said. Elena. He said it back like he was putting it somewhere. How long have you been working here? Since I was 6. And you've been paid? She didn't answer. He looked at Margaret. Then he looked at the 4 remaining customers. Gerald Cross hovering near the door, June Parrish with her hand on a jar of peaches she didn't intend to buy, a young farmer named Dale Hobbs staring at the ceiling, and an older woman, Mrs. Keene, who had closed her eyes. Everybody in this town knows, he said, not loudly, and nobody's done a thing. It wasn't a question. Now look here, Gerald Cross said from the door. That's not a fair— I'm not interested in fair, the man said. Fair's not what happened to her. What came next moved faster than Elena's mind could properly follow. The man, she still didn't know his name, turned back to the counter and finished the trade. Margaret completed the transaction with the tight-lipped efficiency of a woman who was saving her fury for a private moment, which Elena recognized immediately for the threat it was. She began calculating, in the back of her mind, the shape of what the night would look like, whether she could make herself small enough in her little back room, whether she should apologize now or wait, whether apologizing would help or only confirm that she'd done something wrong. She was in the middle of this calculation when the man picked up his trade credit, folded it into his coat pocket, and said, without any particular drama, Elena, get your coat. The store went so quiet that Elena could hear the wind working at the gap under the door. Excuse me, Margaret said. She's coming with me. The hell she is. Margaret stepped around the counter with a speed that surprised everyone in the room, including, apparently, herself. She is not your property to take, and she is not going anywhere. She has obligations here. She has a contract. Show me the contract, he said. Silence. Show it to me, he said again, or she's leaving with me right now. You can't just walk in here and— Nobody stopped you. He looked around the room once more. Nobody stopped you for 22 years, near as I can tell. So I figure that means nobody gets to stop me now. He looked at Elena. His voice dropped just slightly. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not anyone to you. But if you want to leave this place, you can leave with me. Right now, your choice. Elena had never, in her life, been offered a choice. Her hands were shaking. She didn't know when that had started. She could feel her heartbeat in her swollen cheek. She looked at Margaret, at the fury barely contained behind Margaret's eyes, at the promise in that fury, at the map of the next 12 hours she could see spreading out in front of her if she stayed. Then she looked at the stranger. She had no reason to trust him. He was large and unknown, and she had learned very specifically that large and unknown things caused pain. But he'd asked. He hadn't told. He'd asked. Okay, Elena said. The word came out small and roughed up at the edges. Okay, let me get my coat. She owned 4 things: a coat, a change of clothing, a small tin box with $11 in coins she'd accumulated over years by undercounting Margaret's lunch expenses by pennies at a time, and a photograph of her mother that she'd kept hidden in a hole in the baseboard. She got all 4 in under 3 minutes. When she came back through the store, Margaret was still standing at the counter. You'll regret this, she said. You go out that door and you'll freeze to death and nobody will look for you. You understand that? Nobody will come looking. Elena stopped in the middle of the floor. She looked at Margaret, really looked at her, maybe for the first time, at the woman who had shaped her entire life into the shape of that silence and that fist. She didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. She walked out through the door. The cold hit her like a wall and she pulled her coat tighter and the stranger was already walking. Not running, just walking, a long steady pace that covered ground without waste, and she fell in beside him without thinking about it, which was strange because she had never, in her memory, walked beside anyone. They were half a block down the main street when he said, without turning his head, "Name's Rowan. Rowan Blackridge." She said, "Elena Mercer." "I know." A pause. "You already told me." She had. She'd forgotten. They walked in silence for a few more seconds. Around them, Ashridge continued being Ashridge. Someone peering from behind a curtain, a man stopping on the far side of the street to watch them go, a dog lifting its head from a porch and then putting it back down. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Mountains," he said. "I've got a cabin about 2 days north, if the weather holds." 2 days north, into the winter. Elena looked back once at the town she had lived in her entire life. The general store with its faded sign. The alley window of the room she'd slept in for 16 years. The people who had watched and watched and watched and done nothing. She turned back around. "Okay," she said, and she walked forward into the snow. The snow didn't care about any of it. It didn't care that Elena Mercer had just walked out of the only life she'd ever known, with $11 in a tin box and a stranger's name she'd only heard once. It didn't care that her cheek was still swollen, or that her hands were shaking inside her coat pockets, or that every few minutes she had to remind herself to keep breathing normally, because her lungs kept forgetting how. The snow just came down the way it always came down in late November in this part of Montana. Steady, indifferent, piling itself onto everything equally without regard for what was underneath. Rowan walked ahead of her by about half a step. Not in front exactly, more like he'd positioned himself to catch wind before it hit her, which she didn't notice for the first mile and then couldn't stop noticing. He didn't talk much. That was the first thing she cataloged about him. The way his silence was different from Margaret's silence. Margaret's silence was a held weapon, something building toward use. Rowan's silence was just quiet. He moved through it the same way he moved through the snow, without fighting it, without making a production of it, just steadily forward. They cleared the edge of Ashridge before noon. The last building, the old Hicks barn at the north end, empty for 3 years since Walter Hicks lost 2 fingers to frostbite and sold off what was left, fell behind them, and then there was nothing. Just the road, and then half a road, and then a trail, and then a suggestion of a trail, and then trees. Elena had never been past the Hicks barn. She'd known the world was larger, in the abstract way you know things you've never touched. She'd seen maps in the store. Customers brought newspapers sometimes. And once a surveyor had left behind a rolled chart of the mountain territory that Margaret had used for 2 weeks to line a shelf before throwing it out. Elena had studied it during those 2 weeks with a hunger she didn't have a name for. She'd traced the lines with her eyes when she thought no one was watching. But knowing a map and walking into actual mountain wilderness in actual winter were 2 entirely different experiences, and by the second hour she was already beginning to understand the difference in her legs. The trail, what there was of it, climbed. Not gradually. It climbed the way the mountains apparently intended everything to go, which was steeply and without apology. Rowan picked his way with the certainty of a man who had done this specific walk enough times that his feet knew it separate from his mind. Elena followed his footprints exactly, placing each boot where his had been, because the snow was unpredictable, and she had no way of knowing where it was solid ground versus where it was a thin white crust over a rock drop. By the 3rd hour, she was breathing hard. By the 4th, her left boot had developed a wet spot where the seam wasn't holding, and cold was working its way in against her toes. She didn't say anything. Saying something felt like the same category as complaining, and complaining had always been expensive. Rowan stopped at a place where 2 trees had fallen across each other, creating an accidental windbreak. He dropped his pack and said, without turning around, "Rest." "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her then, just briefly. "Your boot's soaking through. Sit down." She opened her mouth and then closed it, because she couldn't tell if it was an order or a fact, and the difference suddenly seemed important in a way she couldn't immediately articulate. She sat down on the fallen log. He crouched in front of her, which was strange enough that she went rigid. A man getting that close, that fast, without warning. And he must have seen something in her face because he stopped and said, "I'm going to look at your boot. That all right?" Nobody had ever asked her that either. "Yeah," she said, after a moment that was probably a beat too long. "Okay." He pulled off her boot with practiced efficiency, turned it over, examined the seam, and then dug into his pack and came out with a small tin of something waxy. He worked it into the seam with his thumb, pressing it into the gap with the focus of a man doing a repair job, which was exactly what it was. "Beeswax," he said. "It won't last forever, but it'll hold today." She watched his hands while he worked. They were large hands, knuckle-scarred, with a long white scar across the back of the right one that had healed badly. Working hands, the kind that knew what they were doing. "Thank you," she said, and it came out stiff because she was out of practice saying it and meaning it at the same time. He put her boot back on and stood up. "Eat something." He held out a piece of dried venison from his coat pocket. She took it. It was tough and oversalted and the best thing she'd eaten in recent memory, which wasn't actually saying much, but she was aware of it anyway. They rested for maybe 15 minutes. The wind moved through the trees above them with a sound like water over rocks. Elena ate her venison and looked at the mountain going up in front of them and thought about the fact that she had no clear plan, no idea where she was, no way back to anything she knew, and was currently sitting in the Montana wilderness in late November with a stranger who hadn't spoken more than 40 words to her since they left. "Why did you do that?" she asked. Rowan was chewing his own piece of venison and looking at the trail ahead. He didn't answer right away. She'd noticed that about him. He didn't rush to fill silence. "Do what?" he said eventually. "In the store. Intervene." She paused. "You didn't know me?" He was quiet for another few seconds. "Didn't need to." "That's not an answer." "Sure it is." He folded the wrapper back into his pocket. "You ready?" She wasn't, entirely, but she stood up anyway. They walked. The afternoon light in November was a stingy thing. It arrived thin and left early, and by the time it started going gray at the edges, Elena was moving on the last of her energy reserves, which she hadn't realized were as depleted as they were until she nearly went sideways on a patch of iced rock, and Rowan's hand caught her elbow without her seeing it move. She jerked away. Hard, automatic, the way you jerk away from something hot before your brain registers the danger. He let go immediately, stepped back, put distance between them without making a thing of it. "Sorry," she said, and hated that she said it because she hadn't done anything wrong. "Don't be." His voice was even. "Didn't mean to startle you." She stood there on the iced rock and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was watching him wait. Just stand there in the trail and wait without crowding her, without doing that thing people did where they said it's fine, but their bodies said otherwise. He just stood there and let her have the space and didn't seem to need anything from her in return. It was disorienting in a way she didn't have language for. "I'm okay," she said finally. "Okay." He turned back to the trail. "Watch that stretch. Ice under the snow." They made camp when the light gave out entirely. Rowan found a spot on the lee side of a granite outcropping, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides, with a flat area large enough to spread his bedroll, and had a fire going in under 10 minutes with wood from a supply he apparently kept cached there, which told Elena this was a regular stopping point on a regular route. He pulled a small iron pan from his pack, melted snow in it for water, and started a thin soup from dried beans and salt pork that he mixed together with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. Elena sat on the far side of the fire and held her cold hands toward the heat and tried to figure out what to do with herself. The fire changed things. In the daylight there had been forward motion, somewhere to aim, something to do. Now there was just the circle of light and the two of them inside it and the darkness pressing in from all sides. And Elena was aware, in a way she hadn't fully let herself be during the walking, that she was very far from anywhere she knew with a man she didn't know, and she had made this choice in under 30 seconds in the middle of a store because he'd asked instead of told. She thought about that. "You trap alone?" she asked, partly because she wanted to understand who he was, and partly because talking was better than the version of quiet that was starting to feel like it had teeth. "Yeah." "Always?" He stirred the soup. "Since I was 17. "How long ago was that?" He considered. 12 years. 29 then. She filed that away for no particular reason. "You have family?" "Had a brother," he said. "He died." She didn't push on that. She recognized the way he said it, the past tense that's been used enough times to go flat. "I'm sorry," she said. "Long time ago." He poured soup into a tin cup and held it out across the fire. "Drink this first, then I'll refill it." She took the cup. The soup was plain to the point of being almost nothing, but it was hot, and hot was everything right now. She drank it slower than she wanted to. "You ever been outside Ashridge?" he asked. "No." He looked at her. "Never? Where would I have gone?" It wasn't a question exactly. He didn't say anything to that. She watched him refill her cup without her having to ask, and pushed down the reflex that told her keeping track of debts was survival. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, not looking at her. Matter of fact, like he was telling her the weather. The words landed strangely. Part of her wanted to say something dismissive, "I know that," or obviously, the way people did when a thing was said out loud that everyone was supposedly already thinking. But the truth was more uncomfortable than that. The truth was she didn't know it. She had no data for it. Every large, capable man she had ever been in proximity to had been at minimum capable of violence and at maximum actively engaged in it, and her nervous system had written that equation in permanent ink a very long time ago. "I don't know that yet," she said, which was maybe the most honest thing she'd said to anyone in years. He nodded. Like that was a reasonable answer. Like it made complete sense that she'd said it, and he wasn't offended or annoyed or moved to prove her wrong right then and there. He just accepted it and went back to his soup. She stayed awake a long time after he rolled into his bedroll on the other side of the fire. She lay on the ground with his spare blanket pulled over her. He'd given it without asking, just spread it out on the ground on her side of the fire before he settled himself the way you'd set out a plate for someone. And she watched the fire go low and listened to the wilderness. Wind, the movement of branches, something distant and four-legged that passed through the trees to the east and kept going. Her cheeks still hurt. The swelling had stiffened in the cold, and there was a dull throb that ran up into her eye socket. She put her fingers against it in the dark. 12 hours ago, she had been stacking tins of biscuits and calculating how to make herself small enough. Now she was on the side of a Montana mountain under a stranger's blanket with the smell of pine smoke in her hair. She didn't know what to do with that, so she filed it away with everything else she didn't know what to do with. And eventually, without meaning to, she slept. The second day was worse than the first. A storm came in around mid-morning. Not a full blizzard, but enough. Wind that cut sideways through every layer of clothing she had. Visibility that dropped to 30 feet, then 20, then sometimes less. The trail disappeared entirely under new snow, and Rowan navigated by landmarks Elena couldn't see. A particular rock formation, the angle of a ridgeline, the way the trees thinned at a specific elevation, moving with a confidence that felt almost unreasonable until she understood it wasn't confidence so much as knowledge. Deep, specific, hard-won knowledge of this exact mountain. She stopped being able to feel her feet around noon. She didn't say anything. She kept walking. Another hour passed. She was starting to trip on things she should have been clearing easily. Her legs were doing something strange, a heavy, disconnected feeling like they were moving through something thicker than air, and there was a part of her brain that knew what this was, and a larger part that was too tired to care. "Elena." Rowan had stopped in front of her. She almost walked into him. "What?" she said. "When did you lose your feet?" She blinked. "What?" "Your feet. When did they go numb?" She looked down at her boots like they might tell her something. "I don't know. A while ago." He said something under his breath that she didn't catch. Then he pointed to a cluster of spruce trees about 20 feet off the trail. "Get in there out of the wind. I can keep—" "Elena." Not sharp. Not angry. Just the kind of firm that didn't leave much room. "Frostbite doesn't announce itself. Get in the trees." She got in the trees. He got a small fire going in a way she wouldn't have thought possible in those conditions, using his own body as a windbreak while he worked the tinder, cupping the flame with both hands until it caught something it could hold. When it was stable, he looked at her and said, "Boots off." "I'm fine." "You said that yesterday too." He sat back on his heels. "And your boot was soaking through, so—" She pulled her boots off. Her socks were damp, her toes were white at the tips in a way that made him exhale slowly through his nose when he saw them, which was more of a reaction than she'd seen from him about most things. He took both her feet in his hands, and she went rigid again, that same reflex. But this one didn't make him step back because this wasn't the same situation, and some part of her knew that even through the alarm, and he worked her feet between his palms with steady pressure, friction, not gentle but purposeful, and the pain that came back into her toes as circulation returned was extraordinary. She made a sound she immediately wished she hadn't. "I know," he said, still working. "It'll pass." "That's easy for you to say." "Yeah," he agreed. "It is." She laughed. It surprised her completely. A short, rough sound, more air than anything else. She couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed at something. She wasn't even certain it counted. But something had come loose in her chest at his complete lack of sympathy about her hurting feet, which was the last response she'd expected, and whatever came loose made that sound come out. He didn't comment on it, just kept working her feet back to something like functional. "Thank you," she said, when the worst of it was past. "Stop thanking me for things that just make sense to do," he said. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. They waited out the worst of the storm under those spruce trees for the better part of 2 hours. Rowan gave her his outer coat and wore just his heavy wool shirt, which she protested and he ignored with the thoroughness of a man who had already decided. He melted snow in his tin cup over the small fire and made her drink water she didn't want because he said dehydration hit hard and cold and she wouldn't feel it coming. She sat with her feet wrapped in a dry cloth from his pack. He'd had a dry cloth, he'd had beeswax, he'd had this entire supply chain of quiet preparedness, and watched him feed small sticks into the fire with the patience of someone who understood that small things, done consistently, were what kept larger things alive. "You do this a lot?" she asked. "Bring people up the mountain?" "No," he said. "Then why me?" He looked at the fire. "Because you were the only one in that store who didn't choose to look away." She frowned. "I was the one getting hit." "Right," he said. "You didn't have the choice, but you still didn't disappear into yourself. You were still there, present." He paused. "Most people, after that long, they go somewhere else in their head. You hadn't." She sat with that for a moment. "That's a strange reason," she said. "Probably." He added another stick to the fire. "You want a strange reason or an honest one? Are those different?" "Sometimes." The storm thinned out by mid-afternoon and they pushed on. The last stretch to the cabin was the steepest, a long switchback climb that Rowan warned her about in advance, which was a simple act of information sharing that Elena filed in the growing ledger of things people could apparently just do, give information without it costing anything. She made the climb. It was not graceful. She slipped twice, caught herself once on a tree branch, and once on her own hands and knees in the snow, and arrived at the top breathing like the air had personally wronged her. Rowan waited at the top each time without comment, without offering a hand she hadn't asked for, without making her feel the indignity of the slip in any way other than the way it already felt on its own. The cabin appeared through the trees as the light was dying. It was small, smaller than she'd imagined, though she hadn't let herself imagine much. Raw timber, a stone chimney, a covered porch with firewood stacked in 2 cords along the wall, a single window facing south, a door with a leather latch. It looked like the most solid thing she'd seen in 2 days. Rowan opened the door and went in ahead of her, and she heard the strike of flint and then saw the glow of a lantern come up from inside. She stood on the porch for a moment in the last of the cold evening air and looked back down the mountain, back the way they'd come. Ashridge was down there somewhere, invisible in the distance and the dark. She turned around and went inside. The cabin was 1 room, a stone fireplace that Rowan was already working on, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot against one wall, and a bedroll on a raised platform against the other. Shelves of supplies. Trapping equipment hung neat on pegs. A small iron stove for cooking. Everything in its place, everything functional, nothing extra. The fire caught, and the room began to change. Warmth moved in from the corners the way warmth does in small spaces. Slow at first, then faster. And Elena stood in the middle of it and felt the cold start to leave her body layer by layer. And something else started moving in to take its place that she couldn't name right away. Later, after a meal she didn't fully taste because she was too tired to do more than eat it, she sat near the fire and looked at her hands in her lap. The swelling in her cheek had gone down some. Her feet ached with a deep bone cold that would take until morning to fully leave. She was alive. She was warm. Nobody had hit her today. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out what came after that. Tonight, she let it be enough. Outside, the wind picked back up and threw itself against the cabin walls like it expected to find something less solid. The timber held. The fire held. Elena sat in the chair by the hearth and listened to the storm work itself out against the walls. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, whatever was outside was not her problem. She was still awake when the fire burned low, turning the room amber and then rust, and then a dim glow that made shadows of everything. She should sleep. Her body was demanding it with a specificity that was hard to ignore. But she sat there a while longer anyway, in the quiet that was just quiet, in the warmth that didn't ask anything from her, listening to the storm outside doing what storms did. And she breathed in, and she breathed out, and she stayed. Morning in the cabin came without ceremony. No bells, no voices from the street below, no sound of Margaret moving around in the front of the store at 5 in the morning, getting ready for the day and expecting Elena to already be ahead of her. Just light, gray and thin, pressing through the south-facing window in a way that was almost tentative, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. And cold, still, the fire having burned down to coals sometime in the night. Elena was awake before the light fully arrived. Old habit. Her body had been waking her before dawn for so long that sleeping past it felt like a failure of attention, even here, even now, even in a place where no one was going to come through the door with expectations. She lay on the narrow cot. Rowan had given it to her without discussion, settling himself on the raised platform with the bedroll like it was the obvious arrangement, and she looked at the ceiling and listened. Wind, the occasional knock of a branch against the cabin wall. Rowan's breathing, slow and even from across the room, the sound of someone who had long since made peace with sleeping on hard surfaces in cold places. The fire settling in the grate. She got up carefully and fed the fire before he woke. Not because she felt obligated exactly, but because she needed something to do with her hands, and the fire needed feeding, and those two facts aligned neatly enough. When Rowan came awake, which he did with the abruptness of someone trained to it, no slow surfacing, just suddenly present, he found the fire going and Elena sitting in the chair nearest the hearth with her knees pulled up and her hands wrapped around a tin cup of water she'd heated. He looked at the fire, then at her. He didn't say thank you, which she'd half expected. He just sat up, ran a hand over his face, and said, "Sleep okay?" "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Good." He stood, and the floorboards announced it. Everything in the cabin was wood, and everything wood was old, and every movement was annotated by creaks and groans that Elena would spend the next several days memorizing until she could identify Rowan's location by sound, alone, without meaning to. That first week established a shape. Rowan went out every morning to check trap lines, a circuit that took anywhere from 2 to 4 hours depending on weather and what he found. Elena stayed in the cabin the first few days because he asked her to, specifically, which she pushed back on the second morning. "I'm not going to sit here all day," she said. "I need to be doing something." He considered that with the seriousness he gave most things. "Can you cook?" "Yes." "Well then." He gestured at the shelves and went out. She could cook. Margaret had taught her that at least, though the lessons had been more in the nature of commands than instruction. She worked through what Rowan had on his shelves: dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a small crock of lard, dried herbs he'd bundled himself, some root vegetables stored in a crate near the floor. And she made things. Real things, not just boiled water with substance in it. She made cornbread in the iron pan, dense and a little rough because the flour was coarse, but hot and real. She made a bean soup with the salt pork and some of the dried herbs that filled the cabin with a smell that had no business being as good as it was given the ingredients. When Rowan came back the first afternoon and ate what she'd made, he said, "This is good." "It's beans," she said. "It's good beans," he said, and went back to eating. She absorbed compliments badly. That was the technical way to put it. The real way to put it was that compliments felt like debts. Someone gave you something nice and you owed them, and the question was always when they'd collect and what they'd want. She was working on reassigning that equation, but it was slow going, and in the meantime she mostly responded to Rowan's occasional sparse approvals with silence or deflection. He didn't seem to require anything else. The cabin had a particular rhythm, and Elena learned it the way she learned most things, by watching carefully and making small adjustments until she fit into the existing shape. Rowan cleaned his trapping equipment in the evenings by the fire. He kept the woodpile supplied with a dedication that suggested genuine anxiety about running short, which she came to understand was reasonable given the elevation and the length of winter here. He read. He had 4 books on a shelf above the door, a Bible he never opened, a surveying manual, a collection of short fiction she didn't recognize, and a worn almanac that he consulted with regularity. He went to bed early and slept hard and woke fast. He didn't crowd her. That was the thing she kept coming back to. He was in the same small room with her most of every day, because winter on the mountain had opinions about how much time you spent outside it, and yet she never felt the walls coming in. He had a talent for occupying space without filling it, for being present without demanding reciprocation. He answered questions directly and didn't ask many of his own, and when he did ask something, it was usually practical. Did she need the water heating? Was she warm enough? Did the boot seam need rewaxing again? Not that the adjustment was smooth. Nothing was smooth. The second week she broke a bowl. Not the bowl. That came later, and differently. This was a smaller thing, a tin cup she knocked off the shelf while reaching past it, and it hit the floor with a clatter that was purely accidental and entirely irrelevant. But her response was not irrelevant. Her response was to go completely still, every muscle in her body tensing at once, her brain already cycling through the opening moves of what came after you broke something. Rowan was at the table and looked up at the sound. She stood there, rigid, and waited. He looked at the cup on the floor, then at her. Something moved across his face, not quite pity, not quite understanding, something more careful than both of those. He got up, picked up the cup, set it back on the shelf, sat back down. "It's a tin cup," he said. "I know," she said. She was working on unclenching her hands. "I know it is." He went back to what he was doing, which was sharpening a trapping knife with a whetstone. The sound of it, a slow rhythmic sliding, filled the silence in a way that was almost deliberate. She sat down slowly. After a moment he said without looking up, "How long did that go on?" She didn't ask what he meant. 22 years, she said, "since I can remember." He kept moving the knife on the stone. "Your mother?" "She died when I was 6. I don't really remember her." "Margaret take you in right after?" "Pretty much." She looked at her hands. She told everyone she did it out of goodness. I think she did it because she needed someone who couldn't leave. Rowan was quiet, then, "She ever get called on it? Anyone in the town?" "Reverend Miles said something once, apparently. That was before my time." A pause. "Margaret donated a new roof to the church the following spring. Nobody said anything after that." He put the knife down on the table. "You deserve to know something," he said, and the shift in his voice made her look up. He was looking directly at her in that way he had, the full attention with nothing behind it trying to take something. "What happened to you wasn't because of anything you did or didn't do. It wasn't because you were difficult or clumsy, or any of the things she said. People like her find a reason. That's what they do." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "I know that," she said finally. "Do you?" She didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. He picked up the knife again. "You'll know it more," he said, after a while. 3 weeks in, something shifted in Elena's sleep. She started waking less. Not all at once. There were still nights where her eyes came open at 2 in the morning, convinced that something was required of her, some task undone, some punishment incoming. But they were getting fewer. Her body was beginning tentatively to understand that mornings here had no agenda beyond what the day actually needed. She started noticing other things, the specific blue of the sky at high elevation on a clear day, a blue that had nothing in common with the washed-out version visible from the alley window in Ashridge. The sound the snow made when it was really cold versus when it was just below freezing. 2 completely different textures of silence. The fact that Rowan always banked the fire carefully before bed, every night, and that this small act had begun to feel like a kind of promise. She also started noticing things about herself that surprised her. She was stronger than she thought. Her body, which had been running on not enough food and too much stress for as long as she could track it, was filling out in small ways. Her hands had stopped shaking in the mornings. She could carry water from the snowmelt barrel outside, heavy, 2 full pails at a time, without needing to stop. Small things. They added up. She had been in the cabin for just over a month when the afternoon of the ceramic bowl arrived. It was a Wednesday, or what she thought was Wednesday based on Rowan's almanac markings, though the days had taken on a different quality here, less like units of measurement and more like weather, each one its own thing. She was reorganizing the supply shelf, which she'd been doing systematically, one section at a time, because the shelves were functional but not well ordered, and her brain liked order in a way she hadn't been allowed to act on for most of her life. The bowl was on the upper shelf. It was the nicest thing in the cabin. Ceramic, hand-painted with a simple blue pattern around the rim, the kind of thing that had a provenance, a history, something someone had chosen specifically. She'd noticed it the first week and avoided touching it because it seemed important in a way the tin cups and iron pans weren't. She was rearranging things around it when her elbow caught it. Time did something strange. Not slow, exactly. More like the moment had too much in it to fit at normal speed. The bowl coming off the shelf. Her hand shooting out and missing. The bowl hitting the floor of the cabin, which was hard-packed dirt over timber, and shattering. Not into two pieces or three, but into many. The clean, decisive fragmentation of something that was going to be all the way broken or not at all. Elena heard a sound she didn't immediately connect to herself, and then her legs gave and she was on the floor, down against the wall below the shelf, her arms up with her hands crossed over her head. She was shaking. She could hear her own breathing, too fast, too loud in the small space. She waited for what came next. What came next was silence, then footsteps. Rowan crossing from the table where he'd been mending a trap harness. She tracked his feet in her peripheral vision, the worn leather of his boots, moving toward the broken pieces on the floor, not toward her. She heard the broom come off its hook by the door, the soft sound of bristles across the floor. Deliberate, slow sweeps. The pieces of the bowl being gathered. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "It was my mother's." Elena's throat closed up. "I'm sorry," she got out. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean." "I know you didn't. I'll find a way to replace it. I have money. I have $11. I can." "Elena." His voice was quiet enough that she stopped. She was still on the floor, still against the wall. She heard him crouch. When she finally made herself look, he was at her level, a few feet away, holding the broom sideways across his knees, not reaching for her, not standing over her, just down where she was. "It was a bowl," he said. "You're not a bowl." She didn't understand what he meant for a second. "Broken things," he said, "can be replaced. Or they can't, and then you grieve them and you move forward. But people aren't things." He held her eyes. "You're not going to be punished for an accident. Not here. Not ever." The shaking in her hands got worse before it got better. She didn't cry. She'd expected to, the way you expect rain when the sky is that color, but what happened instead was something quieter and more fundamental. Some structure deep in the architecture of her fear shifting, a weight redistributing, a chain going slack. It didn't break, not entirely, not that afternoon, but something moved that had been fixed for a long time, and the movement was enormous even if it couldn't be seen from the outside. After a while, she let her arms come down. Rowan stood up and finished sweeping. She got up off the floor slowly, and he handed her the broom so she could finish the last corner, which felt like the right thing to do. And she did it. "Tell me about her," Elena said when she'd put the broom back. "Your mother." He was quiet for a moment. "She came out west from Ohio with my father when she was 19. She didn't know what she was walking into, I think. He was a difficult man." He sat back down at the table. "She made that bowl in the third year they were here, traded a month's worth of canning work with a woman in the next valley who had a kiln." "She painted it herself?" "Yeah, she wasn't particularly good at painting," he said, "but she was particular about that bowl." Elena sat down across from him. "I'm still sorry." "I know." He picked up the trap harness. "It's all right." It wasn't all right, she thought. Losing something from his mother wasn't all right, and they both knew it. But that was different from it being her fault, and she was beginning, haltingly, to understand the difference between those two things. Bad things could happen without someone to blame. Loss could exist without requiring a person to be the cause of it. That was a newer concept than she would have liked to admit. December deepened, and the mountain made its winter intentions clear. Some mornings the temperature was so far below what should have been survivable for a person that Elena stood at the cabin window and watched the stillness outside and genuinely could not connect it to the world she understood. Nothing moved in cold like that. The trees were architectural, frozen into position. Even the wind had given up. On those mornings, Rowan stayed in. He was not a man who needed much entertainment. He could spend an entire morning maintaining equipment in total silence and emerge from it apparently no worse off than he'd gone in. But he also, Elena noticed, made space for her. He asked her things, not prodding things, not therapeutic things, just questions. What was the landscape like in Ashridge? What did she read when she could? What did she know how to do that she'd never been given credit for knowing? That last one caught her. "What do you mean?" she said. "You're good with numbers," he said. "I watched you do Margaret's accounts. You were running 3 calculations at the same time in your head." "She didn't pay me for that." "I know. I'm asking what else there is." She sat with it. "I can read a map," she said slowly. "I can mend things, clothing, basic woodwork. I know a lot about plants, what's medicinal, what's edible. I used to identify them from an encyclopedia Margaret kept behind the counter." She paused. "I know that she never actually looked at the encyclopedia." "She used any of what you knew?" "Twice there were people who came in sick and didn't want to ride to the doctor. I told her what might help, and she told them her own recipe." Elena's voice was dry. She got thanked for it both times. Rowan looked at her steadily. "That's not a small thing," he said. "Knowing plants up here. That's a practical skill." "I know it is, I just never got to practice it." "You can now." She looked at him across the table. He meant it plainly. No subtext, no agenda, just the simple statement that she had time now, and the mountain had plants, and those 2 things could go together if she wanted them to. But the plainness of it hit harder than something complicated would have, because she had spent so long navigating what people meant underneath what they said that direct was almost disorienting. "Okay," she said. The first time she laughed in the cabin, really laughed, not the short, rough sound from the trail, was over a failed batch of cornbread that came out of the pan looking like a geological event. She'd been distracted and left it too long, and it had developed a crust on the bottom that qualified as structural, and when she tried to turn it out and it landed on the table with a sound like a dropped rock, something cracked open in her chest, and she laughed until her eyes watered. Rowan looked at the cornbread. He picked it up. He knocked it against the table once, the way you'd test the density of something you weren't sure about. "Floorboard's loose near the door," he said, completely straight-faced. "Think we could use this to fix it." She laughed harder. She had to put her hand on the table to stay upright. He watched her with something in his face she wasn't ready to look at directly. Not the laugh itself, something about the fact of it. Something that looked like relief. There were harder days, too. Days when the cabin felt like the store, not because of anything Rowan did or didn't do, but because the mind doesn't reorganize on a clean schedule. She woke once at 3 in the morning, certain, for the space of about 4 terrible seconds, that she was back in the storeroom in Ashridge, and everything that had happened since November was a dream she was about to wake from. She sat up in the dark, breathing hard. From across the room, Rowan's voice came, quiet and unhurried. "You're in the cabin. You're on the mountain. You're all right." She didn't know if he'd been awake or had come awake at her sound. She didn't ask. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. She lay down, and the dark was just dark, and the cold was just cold, and she was just where she was, which was not Ashridge. She focused on that until her heart slowed. The fire was banked low and orange, and the cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke and the dried herbs hanging from the rafter above the stove. It took a while, but she slept. By January, she had started taking short walks on her own along the area immediately around the cabin, learning the specific geography of it, where the snowmelt ran off the rock in a way that made the ice unpredictable, where the spruce stand on the east side offered the best wind shelter, where Rowan had cached a secondary wood supply under a tarpaulin she'd found by accident. She brought back things when she found them. A particular dried seed pod she recognized from the encyclopedia. A piece of quartz that caught light in an interesting way. Once a hawk feather that had no practical value, but that she placed on the shelf anyway. Rowan didn't comment on the feather, but it stayed on the shelf where she put it. She was finding slowly the difference between waiting for the next thing to go wrong and simply being in the day she was in. It wasn't a clean transition, It wasn't a moment of revelation so much as an accumulation of moments. The cornbread laugh, the bowl on the floor and the broom, the tin cup that was just a tin cup, the feet worked back to life between someone's hands, the blanket spread out without being asked for, the cup refilled. Small things. They added up. One evening in late January, she was sitting near the fire working on mending a tear in Rowan's spare canvas coat. He'd pointed it out without asking her to fix it, just noting it existed, and she'd picked it up without saying she was going to. When she looked up and found him watching her. Not strangely. Not with anything she needed to be on guard about. Just watching, the way you watch something that interests you. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking you look different than you did in November." She thought about that for a moment. Different how? He considered the word for a while. "Less like you're calculating exits," he said finally. She looked back down at the coat in her hands. Outside, the wind ran along the eaves and moved on. The fire shifted and resettled. She pushed the needle through the canvas and pulled the thread tight and felt, for no specific reason and every reason, the particular quality of a moment that is simply and sufficiently itself, not leading anywhere, not escaping from anything, just present, just real, just here. She kept her eyes on her work, but she didn't argue with what he'd said. February came in mean, not the dramatic storm-driven mean of January, but a low, grinding mean. The kind of cold that had been going long enough to stop being an event and start being a condition. The mountain in February was not beautiful the way people who had never lived on one imagined it to be. It was gray and white and relentless, and the days were slightly longer than December but didn't feel it. And the woodpile went down faster than it should have because a cold that had settled in this deep required more fire to push back. Rowan went out every morning regardless. Elena had stopped telling him to be careful because he didn't need it, and it made her feel like she was performing something she hadn't earned the right to perform yet. Instead, she just made sure there was something hot on the stove when he came back, which was a practical thing she could do, and which he accepted without making it into anything it wasn't. That was the month she started asking him to teach her things. It started with the traps. She'd watched him maintain them long enough that she understood the general principle, and one afternoon she just picked up the harness he was working on and said, "Show me how you set this." He looked at her for a moment and then moved his chair around so they were at the same angle to the table, and he showed her. Not with a lot of words. He demonstrated and let her try and corrected her grip twice without touching her hands, just describing the adjustment in plain language until she found it herself. She liked that, the way he taught without hovering. Over the following 2 weeks, she learned to set 4 different trap configurations. To read snow for animal tracks with enough accuracy to know the difference between a path and a crossing, and to skin a rabbit in under 8 minutes, which she'd initially thought would bother her more than it did. It turned out that a life lived in a general store had given her an entirely pragmatic relationship with where food came from, and the mountain just made that relationship more direct. Rowan watched her get faster at the skinning and said, "You've done this before." Margaret sold dressed game on Fridays. She didn't want to do it herself. She was working the hide off with the same focused patience she gave most practical tasks. There are a lot of things I know how to do that she didn't want to do herself. What else? She considered. Delivered 2 babies. Well, helped. The midwife talked me through the second one because her hands cramped and I was closest. Pulled a man's dislocated shoulder back in place. Took 12 stitches out of a farmer's leg that a doctor had put in and wasn't coming back to remove. She paused. Set a broken finger once, and identified the plant that was making the Hobbs children sick 2 winters ago. Something they were eating in the yard. I recognized it from the encyclopedia. Rowan had stopped what he was doing. "Margaret, know you did that? The Hobbs kids?" She knew I told her what it was. She told Dale Hobbs to remove the plant and gave him her own suggestion for what to give the children for the stomach upset. A brief pause. It was my suggestion. She'd added nutmeg. Did it work? The children recovered in 2 days. Elena set the finished hide aside. Margaret got a jar of honey from the Hobbs farm as thanks. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "You're not angry when you say that," he said. "Most people would be angry." Elena thought about it. "I was angry for a long time," she said. "I think I went past it somewhere. Now it just is what it is." She looked at the hide. "Though I'd like credit for it in the future, for my own work." That's fair, he said. I know it is, she said, and went back to the task. It was in February that she first noticed him doing it. The planning. She caught it by accident, the way you catch things that are being kept from you. A letter he put away too quickly when she came in from outside, a notation in the almanac in a handwriting that was deliberate and careful and different from the shorthand he used for his own records. Numbers. She didn't see enough to be sure what they meant, but they looked like money. She didn't ask. She filed it away. The thaw was a long way off in February, but March arrived with a kind of restlessness in the air that even Elena, new to mountain seasons, could feel. The light changed first, came in at a different angle through the south window, hit the wall at a different height in the afternoon. Then the snow on the south-facing rock faces began pulling back from the edges, just at the margins, just enough to show the granite underneath. The sound of water started somewhere under the ice in the creek below the cabin, faint and persistent, like a conversation in the next room. Rowan became quieter. She noticed it the way she'd learned to notice his silences. Not all silences were the same with him, and the February silences had been the comfortable kind, companionable and unstrained. The March silences were different. They had a weight to them, a thinking-through quality, as if he were working on a problem he hadn't decided how to share yet. She let it be. She'd learned that pushing Rowan produced nothing useful. He would arrive at a thing in his own time, or he wouldn't, and either way the waiting was more productive than the pressing. Meanwhile, she was spending more time outside, learning the terrain in the way she'd been learning everything since November, systematically, attentively, building a map in her mind. She had found 3 different plants under the snow that she identified as having medicinal value once the season turned. She'd found the spot where Rowan kept a 3rd supply cache, which he hadn't told her about and which she didn't mention finding. She'd learned the names of the specific formations on the ridgeline by watching which way the weather moved around them. She was becoming someone who knew this mountain. That realization landed one afternoon in early March, while she was outside pulling water from a snow source Rowan had shown her in a rock crevice, where it ran cleaner than the creek in this season. She was standing there with the pail in her hand, and she had a thought that was so straightforward and so enormous at the same time that she stood still for a moment, holding the pail, and just let it be true. She knew how to be here. Not just survive here, be here, function here. She knew the mountain's moods and its resources and its hazards, and she'd learned them herself, and nobody was going to take that knowledge away from her. She carried the water back to the cabin and didn't say anything about it, but she was different when she came through the door, in some way that couldn't be pointed at specifically. Rowan looked up from the table and then back down at what he was doing, and she thought she saw something in that brief look, though she couldn't have said what. He cooked that night, which he did sometimes when the mood took him. A proper stew with the last of the root vegetables and a rabbit she'd dressed that morning, with cornbread that was better than hers because he had a way of reading the pan she hadn't fully learned yet. They ate at the table, and the fire was good, and the wind was doing something active outside, but not threatening. Normal. After a while, he said, without much preamble, "Spring's about 6 weeks out." "I know," she said. He pushed food around in his bowl. "I've been thinking." "I know that too," she said. "You've been thinking about it for a month." He looked up. "Was it obvious?" "To me," she said. "I don't know about in general." He set down his spoon. She watched him find the words, which took a moment because he was not a man who reached for words without knowing where they were going. "You came up here in November with $11 and a change of clothes," he said. "That's it. You had nothing, and that was because of what was done to you. 22 years of work with no wages. 22 years of being kept down so you couldn't leave." He looked at her steadily. "When the pass opens in spring, I want to help you get somewhere you can start over properly." Elena set her own spoon down. "What does that mean?" she said carefully. "I've been trapping 3 years without spending much. I've got about $240 saved." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without softening it up or dressing it around. "There's a city 4 days south, Carver Falls. It's not huge, but it's got a school, a doctor, a newspaper, a couple of trade businesses. People from all over pass through." He paused. $240 plus your 11. You could get a room for 6 months, find work, build from there. Real work. Paid. The cabin was quiet, in the way cabins go quiet when the thing that was always going to be said finally gets said. Elena looked at him across the table. She felt something happening in her chest that she needed a moment to identify. Not because it was obscure, but because it was several things at once. Gratitude, real and clear. Underneath that, something that hurt. And underneath that, something that didn't want to be examined too quickly. "You've been planning this since November," she said. "Since about December," he said. "Once I could see you were going to make it." She sat with that. "You weren't sure I was going to make it?" "Not in December, no." His voice was even. "You were running on empty in every way a person can run on empty. I wasn't sure what was going to give first." She considered this, the fact that he'd watched her that closely and never made her feel watched. "And now? Now you're a different person than you were on that trail." He picked up his spoon again, a gesture she'd learned meant he was done with the directness for the moment and moving toward practicality. $240. Safe passage down the mountain. A letter of reference if you want it. I know a man in Carver Falls who runs a shipping business. He's decent. He'd read a letter from me. Elena looked at the table. The letter of reference. The shipping business. The room for 6 months. The school and the doctor and the newspaper and people passing through from all over. She could see it. She could construct the image of it. A life that was hers, built on ground that wasn't someone else's. A real wage for real work. Her own door with her own latch. She could see it completely. And she sat there at the table in Rowan's cabin with the fire going and the stew in the bowl and her hands on the table. And she felt something that she did not immediately give a name to, but that lived in the same region of her chest as grief. "You want me to go," she said. The words came out more exposed than she intended. Rowan looked at her. "I want you to have a choice," he said. "You didn't get to have one for 22 years. I'm not going to make another one for you." "That's not what I asked." A pause. He looked at the fire. "No," he said. "It's not." She waited. He didn't fill it. She pushed her chair back and went to stand near the fireplace, because she needed to move and the cabin wasn't large enough for much of it. She stood with her arms crossed and looked at the fire and tried to think clearly, which was difficult because clarity was being interfered with by things she didn't entirely have language for yet. "Did it occur to you," she said, "that you could have asked me what I wanted before you spent 3 months planning my departure?" "It occurred to me," he said. "I didn't want to ask you until the option was real, until the money was there and the plan was solid. It felt wrong to ask someone what they want before you can actually offer it." She turned around. "That's very logical. I know you don't mean that as a compliment." "I don't." She looked at him. "Rowan, do you want me to leave?" He held her look for a long moment. "I think you deserve a life that's yours," he said. "I think you deserve to know what you're capable of in a world that isn't just this mountain and these 4 walls. I think—" He stopped. Started again. "I think if I told you what I wanted and you stayed because of it, I wouldn't be able to live with not knowing whether you stayed for you or for me. You understand?" She understood. She hated that she understood. "So you were going to give me money and a letter and send me down the mountain," she said, "and just continue." "I was going to give you a choice," he said again, "and let you make it. Without any information." "What information?" "About what you wanted," she said. "Without that, it's not a real choice. It's just a transaction. Here's money, here's the door, good luck." She shook her head. "That's what Margaret did. Made decisions about my life that she'd already decided and called it doing right by me." He flinched. It was small and he controlled it quickly, but she saw it. "That's not the same," he said. "I know it's not the same," she said. "I know the difference between you and her. Don't think I don't." She came back to the table, sat down, looked at him straight across the surface that had seen meals and trap harnesses and cornbread and 100 evenings of shared quiet. "But I need to know what I'm actually choosing between. You understand? I can't make a real decision with incomplete information. That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of being managed." He was very still. She watched him work through it. The particular quality of his thinking, the way he considered things from their actual angle rather than the angle he might have preferred. "I don't want you to leave," he said. Finally. Plain, the way he said most things when he'd stripped away the careful parts. "I haven't wanted that for a while. But what I want doesn't—" "It matters," she said. "What you want matters. It's relevant information. It doesn't control me. I'm going to make my own decision. But I needed to know it. He looked at her. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back. They sat with it for a moment. The fire. The stew going cold in both bowls. Outside, the March wind had settled into a low, steady presence, rather than anything dramatic. The money's still there, he said. Whatever you decide, that's yours regardless. I know, she said. And the letter. I know, Rowan. He picked up his spoon again. She did the same. They ate the rest of the meal in a silence that was different from all the other silences, charged in a way that wasn't unpleasant, that had something live inside it, the way air feels before weather. Later that night, she lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and did what she'd always done in hard moments, took the thing apart and looked at the components. What she knew, she had been in this cabin for 4 months. She had arrived with nothing and had built piece by piece a version of herself she recognized and respected. That version was real regardless of what mountain it stood on. She wasn't staying or leaving because of fear, the old calculation, the constant exit mapping that had governed every decision of her life before November. Fear wasn't in the equation anymore. What she felt something about Rowan Blackridge that had been growing since the day on the trail when he'd asked if it was all right before he touched her boot. She had been not looking at it directly for months, the way you don't look directly at something bright. But it was there, and it had always been there, and she was done pretending it wasn't a factor. What she wanted, that was the question. Not what she owed, not what was smart, not what was safe. What she actually, in the deepest and most honest part of herself, wanted. She thought about Carver Falls, the room for 6 months, real wages, her own door. She thought about knowing this mountain the way she was learning to know it. She thought about the hawk feather on the shelf, and the empty space where the ceramic bowl had been, and the way the fire looked in the evenings, and the specific quality of waking up in the morning without anything she needed to be afraid of. She thought about what Rowan had said. I think if I told you what I wanted and you stayed because of it, I wouldn't be able to live with not knowing whether you stayed for you or for me. She understood it. She understood what it meant about him, that he'd rather lose the thing than corrupt it. That was the shape of who he was, and she had known it in small ways since the first afternoon, from the way he'd stepped back on the trail when she flinched, from the cup refilled without asking, from the broom taken up in silence. She knew what she was going to do, but she was going to sit with it until morning, because she'd spent 22 years having no time to think, and she was never going to be rushed through a decision again by anything, including her own certainty. The fire burned low. The cabin held. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the mountain, she could hear, just barely, just at the edge, the sound of the creek beginning to move again under the ice. A thin, persistent sound. Water remembering what it was supposed to do. She closed her eyes and let it run. She woke before the light again, same as always. But this morning was different from other mornings in a way she could feel before she was fully conscious. A clarity that was already present when she opened her eyes, the way an answer sometimes is when you've slept on a question honestly. The ceiling of the cabin was the same raw timber it had always been. The fire was low coals. Rowan's breathing came from across the room, slow and even. She lay still for a moment and let herself know what she already knew. Then she got up and built the fire. She didn't say anything to him when he woke, not right away. She made coffee, real coffee, the last of a small supply Rowan had traded for in November and rationed carefully since. And she put a cup on the table for him when he came to sit down. And she sat across from him with her own cup, and she looked at him in the early light and said, I'm not taking the money. Rowan looked up from the cup. His face was still carrying the last of sleep, not fully assembled yet, and in that unguarded moment she could see something move through it, something quick and complicated that he brought under control before she could fully read it. Elena, let me finish, she said. He closed his mouth. I'm not taking the money, she said again, because what you're trying to buy me is something I already have. You think I need Carver Falls to know what I'm worth? I don't. She held her cup with both hands. I figured that out here, on this mountain, in this cabin. I know what I can do and what I know and what I'm capable of, and I didn't need a city for it. She paused. I needed time, and I needed to not be afraid. That's what you gave me, not the money, the time and the not being afraid. Rowan said nothing. He was watching her with that complete attention she'd stopped flinching from somewhere around December. "I'm not staying because I don't have anywhere to go," she continued. "I want you to understand that specifically. I could go. I could take that money and get to Carver Falls and build something real, and I would probably be all right, because I'm not the same person who walked out of that store in November." She could manage. She was managing all along. She set her cup down. "I'm staying because I want to. Because this is the place where I learned what it felt like to wake up in the morning and not be scared. And because the person who taught me that is sitting across this table right now, and I'm not interested in leaving him." The cabin was very quiet. Outside, something had changed in the quality of the morning. A brightness in the window that was different from winter light, a specific angle that meant the season was genuinely turning. It had been turning for weeks in small ways, but this morning it was undeniable. Rowan looked at her for a long time without speaking. "I need you to be sure," he said finally. His voice was careful in the way things are careful when they matter enough to break. "I need it to be a real choice, not because it's easier than leaving or because the idea of going is frightening. I need it to be what you actually want." "I know you need that," she said. "That's part of why I want it." He exhaled, slow, like something long held. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "I go quiet sometimes for days. I have a temper. I don't aim it at people, but I have one. I make decisions too much on my own because I've been alone so long I forget to think out loud." He looked at her with the honesty that was the most consistent thing about him, the quality she trusted more than any other. "I'm going to get things wrong." "I know," she said. "I'm going to get things wrong too. I have 22 years of bad habits that don't unlearn overnight. I still flinch at loud sounds. I still keep track of things people do for me like their debts. I still wake up at 3 in the morning, sometimes thinking I'm back in that storeroom." She met his eyes. "We're both going to be difficult. I'd rather be difficult with you than straightforward somewhere else." Something shifted in his face then. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that lives in the same territory. A settling. Like a man who has been braced for a long time and has finally, cautiously, let his weight down. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat with their coffee while the light came fully through the window, and the fire caught, and the cabin filled with the particular warmth of a morning that knows what it is. April came. The mountain in April was nothing like November, and nothing like the dead February cold, and nothing Elena had been able to imagine from the inside of winter. It was loud, for one thing. Snowmelt running everywhere, the creek that had been a ghost sound under ice for months now, an actual presence, audible from the cabin, a continuous conversation with itself that Elena found she could fall asleep to and wake to, and that felt absurdly like company. The south faces of the rock were bare. Things grew in the bare places with a determination that looked almost aggressive after the white months. Small, tough, low-lying plants that knew exactly where they were and had adapted accordingly. Elena knew some of their names. She knew more of them as April progressed. She went out with Rowan on the trap lines most mornings now, which had started as wanting to learn and had become simply the shape of their days. He was not a patient teacher in the conventional sense. He didn't explain things twice if once was sufficient, and he assumed competence rather than its absence, which she had discovered was the most effective teaching method anyone had ever applied to her. You were treated as capable, and you rose to it, or you didn't, and she consistently did. "You've got better instincts than you think," he told her one morning when she found a track sequence he'd walked past. "I've been watching the ground my whole life," she said. "Safer than watching people." He considered that. "Fair," he said. "I know." They had developed a language together, not just words, but the full vocabulary of two people who have been in close quarters through a hard winter and come out the other side without having destroyed each other. She knew what his silences meant now by their texture. She could tell the difference between the silence that meant he was thinking through a problem and the one that meant he was simply comfortable, and the one that meant something had bothered him that he hadn't decided how to address yet. He had learned to say her name when he wanted her attention instead of just beginning to speak and assuming she was tracking, something she'd asked for specifically in February, that particular concession, and he'd adjusted without making it into a thing. They were still learning each other. That was accurate. There were still moments of friction, small collisions of habit and expectation that needed negotiating. Rowan did, in fact, make decisions too much on his own, And she did, in fact, have to remind him occasionally that she was in the room and had opinions about things that affected both of them. He received those reminders with more grace than she'd expected, which didn't mean he stopped doing it entirely, just that they'd worked out a way to navigate the territory. She was not, as she'd told him, easy either. The bad dreams didn't vanish with spring. They thinned, became less frequent, became less disorienting when they did come. She could find her way back to the present faster, could feel the solid reality of the cabin around her instead of getting lost in the past for as long. But they were still there, probably would be for a while longer. She'd accepted that as a feature of who she was now, not a flaw to be eliminated. Rowan never made her feel it was a flaw. He just set her name in the dark when she needed it, and that was enough. In the middle of April, she replanted the south-facing slope below the cabin. It had been overgrown with something invasive, a plant she'd identified in March as crowding out the useful growth, and she spent 3 days pulling it back section by section until the ground was clear, and then planted seeds from a cache she'd found in Rowan's supply shelf, labeled in his careful handwriting, yarrow, sorrel, wild onion. He'd collected them at some point with some intention he'd never gotten around to acting on. "You're expanding operations," he said, watching her on the second day from the porch with his coffee. "I'm being practical," she said without looking up. "If we're going to be up here long term, we need more variety in what we can grow and harvest. You've been relying too much on what you can trade for from the valley." "Have I?" he said, not as a disagreement, more like he was noting a fact about himself. "Yes. 3 trips down in winter is too many. If the weather had been worse in January, you'd have been in trouble." "I've been making do for years," he said mildly. "I know," she said. "You can do better than making do." There was a pause on the porch. "You're right," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd cleared. The soil here was thinner than it looked. Mountain soil always was, but it was workable. Things could grow in it. Things would grow in it. "Also," she said, "I want a window on the north wall." Another pause. "That's a structural change," he said. "I know, you'd have to cut the timber correctly and brace the frame. I watched you fix the porch support last month. You know how to do it." "Elena." She looked at him. He was standing on the porch with his coffee and the particular look of a man who was losing an argument he hadn't expected to have, and found he didn't actually mind losing. "A window on the north wall," he said. "More light in winter," she said. "It's dark in there by 2 in the afternoon." "It's a mountain cabin." "It can be a mountain cabin with 2 windows." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went inside and she heard him moving around, and when he came back out, he had the measuring tools. She smiled at her seedbed and kept planting. The north window took a week to build properly. Rowan did the structural work and she helped with the framing and the finishing, learning as she went in the way she'd learned everything up here, by doing, by asking when she didn't know, by not pretending competence she didn't have and not hiding competence she did. The window was not perfectly square. There was a gap at the upper right corner that required additional sealing with pine pitch and some creative thinking about the interior ledge. It let in more light than either of them had predicted. On the first afternoon, with it finished and open, the weather was warm enough for that by then, Elena stood in the center of the cabin and watched the north light come in at an angle she hadn't been able to see before. And she thought about Margaret Holt's store, about the alley window that faced nothing, that let in enough light to work by, but not enough to make you feel anything, and she thought, every window is a choice about what you let in. She didn't say that out loud. It was the kind of thought she'd once have kept locked away because the person most likely to hear it would have found something cruel to do with it. Now she kept it simply because it was hers and she didn't have to share everything, and that distinction between choosing to keep something versus being forced to hide it was one of the more important distinctions she'd worked out about herself over the winter. May came warm, warmer than Rowan said it usually came, which he said with the mild suspicion of a man who mistrusts any gift from the weather that arrives ahead of schedule. The snowmelt was running hard and fast, the trail down to the valley was fully passable, and the world below the mountain was audible in a way it hadn't been since November. Distant, but present. Real. He asked her on a warm evening in May while they were on the porch watching the last light leave the ridgeline. "Do you miss it? Down there?" She thought about that honestly. "I miss the idea of it sometimes," she said. "The idea of other people, noise, things moving." She considered. I don't miss Ashridge. I didn't miss it when I was there. I meant generally, not Ashridge specifically. I know what you meant. She was quiet for a moment. We should go down sometime. Not to stay, just to go. Get supplies properly instead of that half trip you did in February. Let me see what's in the valley. We could do that. And I want to send a letter, she said, to the man you mentioned in Carver Falls, the one with the shipping business. Rowan looked at her. Not for what you're thinking, she said. I want to ask if he knows anyone with a need for someone who understands plants medicinally. There might be a market for dried preparations, salves, tinctures, things I can make up here and send down. He was quiet for a moment. You want to start a trade. I want to start something that's mine, she said. That I built. With knowledge I have. She looked at the ridgeline. I don't want to be dependent on the trapping income. Not because I don't trust you. I do. But because I need to bring something to this that's mine. You already bring... I know what I bring, she said, and there was something quiet and firm in it that stopped him. Not sharply, just with the certainty of a woman who had spent enough time knowing her own value in silence and was done making herself small about it, even in good company. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. I'm asking if you have a problem with it. A pause. No, he said. I think it's a good idea. I know you do, she said. I just needed to say it that way. He nodded. The light finished leaving the ridge. They sat in the blue-gray of the settling evening, and it was comfortable. And it was real. The letter went down with a trader in early June, carried south with a bundle of Rowan's pelts. Elena had written it herself, in the careful handwriting she'd practiced on Rowan's old almanac pages over the winter when she wanted to improve her penmanship for no reason she'd been able to articulate at the time and which seemed obvious now. She'd described what she knew, what she could make, what she was offering. She'd been direct and specific and had not softened the language or made herself sound smaller than she was. Rowan had read it when she was done, because she'd asked him to, not for permission, but because 2 sets of eyes on a business letter was just practical, and she was pragmatic enough to know the difference between independence and unnecessary stubbornness. It's good, he said. It's direct. I know, she said, and took it back. The reply came 6 weeks later, carried back up by the same trader on his return circuit. Elena read it on the porch in the morning light, while Rowan had coffee at the table inside. A man named Thomas Carley, who ran a general goods operation in Carver Falls, and supplied 3 smaller settlements in the surrounding area. He was interested. He wanted to know what she could provide reliably and in what quantities. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she went inside. He wants to talk terms, she said. Rowan looked up. We'll need to go down in August, she said. I want to meet him in person before I agree to anything. We can do that, Rowan said. She put the letter on the shelf next to the hawk feather, which was still there. It had stayed there all winter and into spring, and she'd never moved it. And Rowan had never moved it. And at some point it had become simply part of the cabin's permanent inventory, without either of them deciding it had. That was how things worked up here. Not by announcement, by accumulation, by staying. August came. They went down the mountain together for the first time since November. Elena wore her own coat, which she'd reinforced at the seams herself over the winter, and Rowan's pack carried trade pelts and 2 months of dried herb preparations she'd put together with meticulous care and labeled in her own handwriting. The trail was not the same trail she'd climbed in November, partly because it was summer, and the difference between a snow-buried mountain path and a summer one was the difference between 2 entirely different geographic features. But partly it was that she was not the same person who had followed Rowan's footprints exactly, placing each boot where his had been because she didn't trust her own reading of the ground. She walked beside him now. Same pace. Her own line. They didn't speak much on the way down. The mountain was doing too much. Alive in summer in a way that was almost excessive after the restraint of winter, green and loud and layered with sound. The creek running strong and visible below, hawks working the thermals off the south ridge. Elena watched it all and thought about the gray-green light through a storeroom window and the sound of Margaret's step in the front of the store and the particular shape of waiting for the next thing to go wrong. It all seemed very far away. Not gone. She wasn't naive enough to think it was gone. Trauma doesn't relocate simply because the geography changes. but it was behind her now in a real way. Not just in direction, but in dimension, like something that had happened to someone slightly younger with fewer resources and no one in her corner. She had someone in her corner. She had herself in her corner, which was newer and, if she was being honest, more important. The valley came into view around mid-afternoon, wider than she remembered it from November, when the snow had compressed everything, green and brown and cut through by a real road. A cluster of buildings that wasn't Ashridge, smaller, actually, just a few farms and a way station, but it was not the place she'd come from, and that distinction mattered enormously. Carver Falls was another 2 days south. They stayed the first night at the way station, a rough but functional place with a communal fire and 3 other travelers passing through. And Elena sat across the fire from people she'd never met and talked, followed a conversation for its own interest, offered what she knew about routes and weather patterns on the mountain because they were asking and she actually knew. And when she went to sleep that night, she lay in the dark thinking about the girl who had stood in a general store with her arms crossed over her face and waited for what came next. She thought, I know what came next. Carver Falls was larger than she'd expected and smaller than she'd feared. A real town, with the markers of one, a hardware store and a post office, and a school with children visible through the windows in the morning, a doctor's shingle on the main street, 3 competing general goods operations, and a newspaper that came out twice a week. People moved through it with purpose. Strangers were not remarkable. Nobody knew who Elena Mercer was. That was a gift she hadn't known to ask for. She walked down the main street beside Rowan, and she was simply a woman from the mountain with dried herb preparations in her pack and a letter of introduction to a man named Thomas Carley, and that was all she was to anyone they passed. She squared her shoulders and felt the weight of 22 years lift about another degree. Thomas Carley turned out to be a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a gray beard and reading glasses he kept losing on top of his own head. He read her letter, looked at her samples with the focused attention of someone who actually knew what he was looking at, asked 3 direct questions about drying methods and shelf life and what she could produce per month, and said he wanted to start with a trial order and see how it moved. Fair, Elena said. He looked at her over his glasses. You've done business before? Not formally, she said. I kept books for a general store for 16 years without wages, though. I know how the numbers work. He blinked. Rowan, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him steady in the way he went steady when something confirmed a thing he'd already known. Well, Carley said, I suppose we'll see. Yes, Elena said. We will. They were back on this mountain in 4 days. The trail up was harder than the trail down, always was, but Elena's body knew it now, knew the particular demands of the elevation change, paced itself accordingly, read the terrain without having to think about it consciously. Her legs remembered. The cabin appeared through the trees in the late afternoon, the same raw timber and stone chimney and covered porch, and she felt something when she saw it that she had no interest in understating. She felt home. Not the home of something familiar regardless of quality, the way Ashridge had been familiar. A cage you could navigate with your eyes closed. This was the other kind, the kind you choose, that costs you something real to build and costs you nothing to return to. She went in ahead of Rowan and stood in the center of the room. The north window let in the last of the afternoon light, at an angle that hit the shelf where the hawk feather and Thomas Carley's first letter now sat together. The fire needed building. The herb preparations on the drying line needed checking. There was a gap in the woodpile that would need addressing before fall. There was work. There was always work. She took off her coat and hung it on the peg by the door, and she started on the fire. And Rowan came in and dropped his pack, and without discussion, they moved through the familiar small mechanics of coming home. The fire, the water, the inventory of what was needed. 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms over a hard winter and carried those rhythms into spring and now into the lean green warmth of summer. She had thought once that the best she could hope for was to survive 1 hour at a time, to keep herself below the line of attention, to anticipate punishment, to be grateful for the absence of pain as if absence were the same as good. She understood now that it was not. Good was something you built. It was not given, and it was not guaranteed, and it could not be rescued into existence by someone else, no matter how decent that someone was. Rowan had opened a door. He had stood in a store in November and refused to look away, and then he had opened a door and stood back from it, And everything after that had been Elena walking through it herself, on her own legs, with her own eyes open. That was the part nobody told you about survival. Not the leaving. The leaving was just the beginning. The part that actually mattered was the long, slow work of deciding what you were building in the place where the fear used to live. She was still building it. She would be building it for years, probably, filling in the corners, discovering new rooms, finding places that still needed repair. That was the nature of the thing. You didn't finish. You just kept going. The fire caught. Outside, the mountain did what it always did. Went on being the mountain, indifferent and enormous and full of things worth knowing for those willing to learn them. The creek ran. The hawks worked the ridgeline. The first stars appeared above the timber. Inside, the cabin held its warmth the way a good thing holds what it's given. Not perfectly, not without effort, but reliably, consistently. With the kind of solidity that comes not from never having been damaged, but from having been built by someone who understood what the weather was going to do and prepared for it anyway. Elena sat in the chair by the fire and felt the day settle off her shoulders. Rowan sat across from her, as he had across 100 evenings, and he was reading the almanac with his boots near the fire, and there was nothing remarkable about the moment and everything right about it. She had been a girl everyone ignored. She was not that anymore. She was something she had made herself, piece by piece, in the unforgiving mountain winter, out of the raw material of everything she'd survived and everything she'd been given and everything she'd figured out on her own when nobody was looking. She was someone who could read a track and set a trap and bring a baby into the world and keep books and grow things in thin soil and speak plainly to a businessman and build a window in a wall that didn't have one. She was someone who had chosen, with full information and no fear in the equation,